Hi, my name is Rachel and I'm a part of Jim's Conveyancing. And I've got my lovely guest here, Ben Mitchell. And tell me about yourself, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. My name is Ben Mitchell and my business is Yorkie Advocacy. I'm a property buyer's advocate, so I love helping people navigate the Melbourne property market. Dealing with things like underquoting or referring through to conveyancers for contract reviews, just to make sure that people aren't wasting time on properties that are ill-suited or never going to be within their budget. And then really taking over the whole process and looking at negotiating with the agents, attending auctions and sourcing properties both on market and properties that aren't yet on the market as well.
Okay, so it might sound a little bit silly, but even before I started in property, the idea of a buyer's advocate really for me wasn't a service that really came to mind. I didn't know, and it sounds ridiculous that they didn't actually exist.
Yeah,
So is it sort of a more recent thing that has happened really in terms of it becoming an industry in itself?
It has been around in Australia for at least a decade. I think traditionally it's more your wealthier side of the market, the time poor people that have been using the services of advocates. But as the stock levels get lower, the demand gets higher for property and it's harder to navigate the system. A lot of first home buyers in particular have started using buyers advocates as they can really see the value of outsourcing and using an expert, because it's not every day that you do buy property.
Right.
And the costs involved aren't as high as what people might think as well.
And I think a lot of, particularly with first home buyers, because it's such a, I think, would you reckon that Australia has, if not the toughest property market out there, or one of, possibly?
Definitely one of. I mean, Australians are property obsessed, so
it's part of our culture.
Totally.
It's the Australian dream, really. Who doesn't want to own a property? Whereas if you go over to Europe, it's very common for, and I guess it's more accepted for people to be long-term, lifelong renters, really. So
particularly in Scandinavian countries as well, a lot of them have got actually, a certain percentage, like Vienna, I think it is, has got something like 50% of homes are actually social housing.
Really?
And it's the norm. And when you do rent those social houses, you're not just renting them for a few years. You can actually have them for life and then pass them on to your children as well once you're gone. Yeah.
It's quite interesting, really. But I guess with such a tough, like as you said, low stocks, and for the last couple of months, we've seen the stabilisation of interest rates. But as well, they've never really been, at least in the last decade, at such a all-time high, really.
I think with 2012, I think was when the interest rates were this high. So whilst it does seem high to maybe the younger generation, it's probably actually a normalisation of interest rates.
Of course.
Because interest rates of 1% or less is free money, really.
Well, exactly right. And it wasn't at the time where, and I did some work with Dale, who's a mutual friend of ours, who's a mortgage broker. I did some work with him, and at that time, it was about 5 years ago, interest rates are at 1.7, 1.9%. And it really wasn't sustainable anyway. And when my parents back in the 80s bought a property, the highest interest rate that they ever experienced was 18%. So you're correct in saying so. However, there's also the fact that properties have never been so expensive.
And when you factor in your parents, my parents, and the percentage of income that they were spending to purchase these homes, it was very, their homes, it was very, very different to the percentage of income that you're spending on a home now, or the other way around, sorry.
Definitely.
But what we've seen in the past with interest rates is there's been a lot of noise around interest rates, and yes, it has put a lot of pressure on a lot of families, particularly with the rising cost of living as well. But what we haven't seen is that real mortgage cliff and people, mortgagee sales and things like that. You haven't seen blood on the streets. So
No.
it's actually, everybody I think now is taking a deep breath in and going, okay, this is where we are now. And you'll find next year, I think things are really going to take off again. People are going to be out there transacting on properties because there has been low stock for the past 12 months or so. And, there's lots of differing opinions on why. But one reason that I see out there is we're not seeing lots of movement in terms of people upgrading from one home to another.
Okay.
That's because the stock levels are so low. It's so hard to find that next property. You're going to be spending a premium. And then by the time you factor in, stamp duty and sale cost and things like that, it might not be worth the risk of spending, a couple of $100,000 just to move, then the extra in price point, and you're getting something marginally better. So a lot of people have been sitting on their hands, and that has resulted in low stock. Also, construction costs are at an all-time high. They were really fluctuating through COVID so much. I was speaking to Emily Potter that you met at our one of our networking meetings, and Emily was of the opinion that prices probably have peaked and stabilised for the construction costs.
Really? Quite interesting. And it's also been, and it's definitely the building industry has very much been in spotlight. And if anything, a lot of people aren't willing anymore to buy home and land packages because we've seen what has happened, particularly with, was it Metricon?
Yeah, there's actually a few builders that have gone under, and you're left with a half-completed project and no money to finish that project, and then to even try and find the tradespeople and the builders to come in and finish it, or even if you're doing renovations, just to try and find those tradespeople. So pre-pandemic and even during the pandemic, people would see those rundown properties as a little bit of a hobby, let's do it like on the block. Now people are really steering clear of those sorts of properties that do need significant work. They're really looking for something that is as close to turnkey as possible.
Absolutely. And what is sort of more, so if anything, definitely I think given how competitive the market is just simply because of those low stocks, high prices. So it's worthwhile having an advocate and partnering up with one, particularly even as a first home buyer, because it's just so hard to get in.
It is hard, and when you're under that much pressure, you can often make a poor decision in the type of property that you do buy. Not to mention, and I'm sure you see this, Rachel, people coming back for multiple contract reviews because they get a contract reviewed, they pay for a building and pest inspection, they get emotionally involved in a property because it's quoted, 600 to 660, but really it's worth 750, and that's how much it sells for. So the amount of or a lot of what I do is actually gently guide or gently realign my clients' expectations to reality and stop them wasting time and emotional energy and money on properties that are never going to sell within their budget. Or maybe steer them clear of a bit of a lemon property as well.
Oh yes, like the classic example of flammable cladding.
Flammable cladding next to a freeway, you name it.
Exactly. And if anything, with your current clients, or in fact, what you've mostly seen with, realigning expectations, even with first-home buyers, which is definitely what you more specialise in, really. You love helping first-home buyers. What sort of, what do people expect or look out for when buying property these days? What's the general, the expectation of what a property needs to have in order to be able to more sellable?
Yeah, it depends what the buyer's goals are. So some people want to buy land interstate where they're going to get great cash flow or great capital growth, and they want to be rent investors and they don't mind that. Other people, they want to buy something so that they've got a home. They want something where they've got security. They want a base, and they still want their smash tavo on toast. So they want to be near the urban areas and things like that. So it really depends on the goals. But a lot of the first home buyers and the types of properties that we're buying, if they're looking at an apartment, I generally recommend you going for an older style apartment in a boutique block with a large floor plan. Villa units have become so popular. People that can't afford a house or they can't afford even a townhouse, a villa unit, which maybe used to be seen as the blue rinse brigade, the older people living in those homes, they have become so popular because they're the next best thing. And if you can afford a townhouse, if you're looking at something that's on either at the front or preferably at the back rather than in the middle, they're the sorts of points of difference you want to be looking for when you're looking for those sorts of properties.
And it's interesting that you say with older style of unit complexes, because even in my contract reviews, and I've noticed this, a lot of the the newer apartment complexes that that have been built recently in the last 5 to 10 years, the amount of problems that they actually have because they're poorly built by these developers, and I see it all the time in comparison to my contract reviews for older unit complexes, like Hawthorne, for example. When I was, for one of my clients that I assisted in February, he was looking at these large unit complexes and would just have these ongoing problems that I'd identified until he, not that I told him what sort of property he should be looking for, but he looked at like more of the old unit complexes that were built in the 80s based in Hawthorne, you don't find any sort of problems in comparison to those newer unit complexes.
You know, you can look at them and you're going to go, well, it's not going to burn down. Whereas some of the more modern ones that have got the flammable cladding, then you'd be a bit worried there. A lot of the modern ones, as you say, defects reports, but then the builders go under, so you can't get them fixed under any sort of warranty. So there is a big risk. Generally, your OC fees are a lot higher because those sorts of buildings have generally got an elevator or two. When you start having some of the other bells and whistles like the pool and the gym, you know, the OC fees jump up, whereas those older buildings, and when you're looking at getting into the market and buying something, and in my opinion, you want something that's going to get a bit of capital growth, and the older ones with the larger floor plans and boutique blocks generally have a higher degree of capital growth in them also. But when you talk about problems, you know, you've got to be very careful no matter what the type of building you're looking at. Really go through the OC notes. If there's something like, oh, we've had a quote to have the roof replaced, you know, that should have alarm bells going for you. So you can't just blanket and say older buildings are better. Generally they are, but they still have their ongoing maintenance requirements as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, having also a conveyancer to have a look through those minute meetings of the OC course, they're a gold mine, because they're a gold mine to buyers, because really the sort of, and a lot of conveyancers actually skip over those minutes. Really, you need to read them very carefully, because the ramifications for your client, they could be inheriting, you know, tens of thousands of dollars of special levies for the exact type of properties that you've described.
Yep. Always, no matter what you're doing when you're buying a property, always have the contract reviewed by a professional, a conveyancer, before you sign anything. Don't sign it if you haven't had it reviewed.
It's a very common mistake, and if anything, a lot of people don't realise, you know, I've said it before in another video, but it's very true. Some people, and particularly for first-time buyers, there's a lack of education around buying property in Australia, and it's really reflected in the sort of calls that I get for help to try to get out of these contracts, because, you know, that's sort of the belief that you can treat them like Netflix subscriptions, and you can't. Sorry, you can't just terminate these contracts unless if you fall within the cooling off period. So via private sale, so within 3 business days of signing that contract. But Ben's very right. Get a conveyancer, get the advice of a buyer's advocate, particularly even with the buyer's advocate, which is now becoming a more popular means of guiding the market.
And required as well. The amount of people that come to me and have been looking for 10 months,
really,
you know, down to an average of 30 odd days of looking. It'll save you time, it'll save you money, it'll get you into the market quicker, and you'll get your weekends back as well.
Well, exactly right. And also you've got the benefit as well of having someone like Ben and other buyers advocates as well, having someone that's spent, tell me a little bit about your experience in the real estate industry. How many years do you have to offer to your clients?
Well, my background, before I started my business, which was 2.5 years ago, my background's actually real estate. I've done everything from being a sales cadet. I've been in leasing, which was such a fun job as well, honestly. Drive around and see 40 different properties in a week. It was fantastic.
Beautiful.
And some of them were great and some of them were not so great.
Yeah.
But my favourite role in real estate was actually as a business development manager. So I was working with our sales team, dealing with investors that were purchasing properties and bringing them onto our rent roll, or dealing with people who were buying their second property through our agency, and then I would come in and help them lease out their first property. And there was a lot of, what I loved about it is there was a real emotional connection to that first property that they had. It was like their baby, and it was a lot of hand holding and a lot of education. You know, how am I going to get a really good quality tenant? What if this happens? What sort of, how are we going to market the property to get you the best result? And that's what I really loved, and that's what I've taken into the advocacy space, and why I love working with first home buyers particularly. It's because they really appreciate the education, the hand-holding, the reassurance. But having that real estate background, you know, when I'm dealing with the real estate agents, I know how to speak their language. Even if I'm buying for a first home buyer, I'm always thinking about the future. how is this property going to perform on the rental market? Because I know exactly the properties that are going to fly with, 5 different applications on Monday morning versus the one that's going to sit there over and over, and you're going to get a tenant, might not be great quality, and then it turns over every 12 months because it's not a great property. So that's always in the back of my mind, but being able to speak the agent language, understanding the scripts and the dialogues that they're using to negotiate, and also the process and the legislation around quote ranges and things like that, and how your negotiation or the negotiation tactics that an experienced real estate professional is going to use can actually save buyers money and get their leg up against their competition as well.
Absolutely, and that's why having someone from the start of the process, rather than wasting 10 months of your time, really, you can help someone.
And money on the building inspection costs that you waste, or the contract reviews, or whatever it might be.
Thousands of dollars.
Or the market increasing in that 10 months when you've not been in the market as well.
Well, that's right, really. And in terms of pricing, what do you charge?
Oh, that really depends.
Of
So
course.
I don't charge a percentage, so people aren't penalised if the price is going to be higher. I just charge a flat fee, but that's staggered depending on what their budget is.
No, fair enough. So definitely, at least, and I know it as well with some of my clients that I've been dealing with for the last year, and they're still yet to get into the market, really. That's definitely, and it's not even an insult to be offered and told you might actually need some education, some help around your property search, and definitely coupling up with the buyer's advocate, and particularly with someone like yourself that has that proper real estate background. You understand the lingo, you know the good areas to buy in.
And the features of a property that are going to stand out, because your circumstances will change, and you will either sell it or you will rent it out. And the one thing to remember is if you're dealing with a competitive property now, it's always going to be competitive in the future as well. Whereas if you buy the property that's really not got anybody going, it's been on the market for 4 months, you've got to question why. Now, either there's going to be something wrong with the property, or there's a negative feature about it. But don't use that as a blanket rule, because sometimes the vendor's expectations might have been unrealistic from the beginning and they've actually overpriced the property.
Right.
And then the property's gone stale on the market and people go, oh, that's been online, there must be something wrong with it.
Yep.
So, look at everything. There's no blanket rule. Just make sure you look at every property individually.
Yep. And even sort of more broadly, let's talk about recent suburbs of Melbourne. What really sort of trends that you've noticed with your clients and in the market? What sort of areas, particularly for first-home buyers, would be ideal to buy in?
It depends on what their goals are as well,
Okay.
because obviously, a suburb like South Yarra, it's going to be more expensive and the property is probably going to be much smaller. I personally wouldn't buy in any of the big towers. I'd be looking for older boutique stuff. But then if you were head out a little bit to maybe Carnegie or Murrumbina or Ormond, those villa units are really fantastic. And you've got different cultures and different suburbs as well in terms of the way that people live. You can cross over Dandenong Road and it's like you're in a different world again. Where the key thing is public transport links. And I bang on to it with my clients, even if they don't use public transport. Always, if you need to be in, I would always be looking walking distance from public transport, particularly a train station. Commute time to the city, it's always going to hold its value. It's always going to grow its value. That's really, really key.
And other things to consider would be things like universities or...
Oh, yeah. Obviously, if you're looking at rental income and things
Right.
like that, then universities, hospitals are great. Yeah.
And sort of a more specific question, which for an ideal sort of property investment for anyone really, would you still argue that student apartments are still the way to go or not at all?
Oh,
No.
I would never.
Really? Yeah, fair
Personally.
enough. Okay.
Look, it depends on what your goals are. If you're an older person who doesn't need to grow their wealth, they're very good cash flow vehicles.
Right.
But if you're a young person, what's the point in just having your cash flow every week and you've got an asset that's probably not going to grow?
Right. Good point. Now let's talk about, for those wondering out there that are listening in, how to actually start the process of buying a property, because it's just there's so many different boxes that you have to go through and tick off in the property search. So
look, I've got a first home buyer's guide that you can actually download from my website.
Right.
And that can really sit you down and work out, well, what's the reason I'm buying? Why do I want to buy? Therefore, where do I want to buy? But the first step after that, when you decide, okay, I want to know how much I can borrow, mortgage broker. 100% go and see a mortgage broker. They've got access to multiple banks, sub-tier lenders, different types of lending that maybe your big four banks might not give you. So, but go and see a mortgage broker because they will give you best rates and give you a realistic expectation on how much money you can borrow and what your repayments are going to be like as well. So, is that first of all you can decide what your budget is. Then you can look at, what's that budget going to be able to buy me in different suburbs, and what are my goals? Do I want to grow wealth by buying something that's going to get lots of capital growth, or do I want something that I'm going to live in, which is closer to the city, or maybe I need to jump over a few suburbs? Yeah,
definitely really important to understand what your budget is first, and when you're sort of more. There's probably a lot of questions. When do I start talking to a conveyancer as well? Is when you're in a position, you understand your borrowing capacity. Ideally, you want to have a pre-approval first because a lot of conveyancers, at least myself, offer complimentary contract reviews after the first X amount, which you can call me about. But definitely, when you're at a point where you're going to start making serious offers on properties you've been looking for a while, that's when you get onto the phone to a conveyancer and definitely having them do a contract review, providing you guidance around, the sort of conditions. And I actually would like some advice on should I have more conditions or less really, but we'll talk about that shortly. And, having them go through and advising you on whether from at least a legal perspective, it is a good purchase or if it's not, and if it's a good contract to sign, or whether it's not too. And one of the questions that a lot of my clients ask me is that even a conveyancer themselves, they sort of, in an inadvertent way, not to step on toes, they sort of act as a buyer's advocate in themselves to provide guidance around the sort of conditions to protect yourself when making an offer. But definitely one of the questions that I ask, and I always put the onus, obviously provide an advice, but the onus back on my clients in terms of what their offers should be and what they look like with that advice. But one of them I get is the concern of if my offer has too many conditions, is that going to make me less competitive than the other person making an offer with less conditions?
Well, potentially. It depends if there is another person making offers.
True.
Look, and I've been in the position where I've put on offers with conditions, but I've done it in a way which is a bit cheeky, I suppose.
Okay.
But again, that's knowing the legislation. So I'll give this little tip away. If you're doing a building and pest inspection and you've got you don't want to do it beforehand, you want to do it once your offer's been accepted, don't make it 10 days. Make it 3 business days. It's the same as the cooling off period. A building inspector, if you're using an advocate, can get you a building inspector there the next day. And if for any reason you need an extension, your conveyancer can just put in a request for an extension. A vendor is unlikely to say no. But the 3 days being the same as the cooling off period means it's not threatening to the vendor. So that's one tip, one thing I always do as well. But going back to your point about when you should engage a conveyancer, so I always talk about the cocoon, really cocooning my clients between, mortgage broker, building inspector, conveyancer. Things in real estate can move from 0 to 100 in the space of an afternoon. You don't want to be picking up the phone and calling random conveyancers saying, "Oh, I need a contract review this afternoon," and they don't know who you are. Call and engage your conveyancer at the beginning of the process, so as that when you do get that property you love and you find out it's going to be sold at 5 p.m, you can pick up the phone and say, "Hi Rachel, it's Ben. I really need this contract reviewed," and at least Rachel knows who I am and can do it for you. So that would be really one piece of advice, is get all of your team in line ready to go at the beginning of the process. So you don't need to be hunting for people to do last minute jobs and potentially miss out on a property because you couldn't find somebody to review the contract.
Exactly right. And plus, if I know that for my longer term clients, if they give me that call on a Friday, I'm more likely to do it myself if you're working with me long
I
term.
love a Friday contract review.
Oh, who doesn't? No. It's wine worthy, really, but not that I drink while doing my contract reviews. But either way, but no, it's very true. And I like the idea of what you say with the cocoon, really, because it keeps it all sort of more in-house, if anything, rather than, and I get it all the time. I get it, and even with a conveyancer, get one that's available to do reviews for you on a Saturday. Because a lot of law firms out there, a lot of lawyers don't work on Saturdays. I know myself, for the right client and for the right property, 100%, if I know that you need to make an offer on a Saturday, I will do it for you. So really think about that availability as well for weekends, because from your experience, a lot happens on Saturdays in the property market too.
What can happen on a Sunday in the property
Exactly.
market?
Exactly right.
Sorry to throw you on a Sunday, but
Yeah,
it
it's true.
does happen because if somebody comes in, they've got an acceptable offer. Look, most agents will push that out to 5 p.m. on the Monday, but you still, if there's complexities in there, you want to be able to understand them so as that you can put the best strategy in place to make sure that you're successful over the other parties.
Exactly. But I get it all the time. And I feel like with my clients, they'll tell me after I deal with them for several months that there's a sense of hopelessness and misdirection in the property market and a real resentment towards the process. And, sort of thinking, how do I get there in the end? How come other people around me can get into the market, but I can't? When I know I have a borrowing capacity, the bank will finance me. What am I doing wrong? So with those, for people out there that are listening in that really do feel that sense of hopelessness, what do you think that they're doing wrong?
Well, look, they're not doing anything wrong because they're looking at the price guides and they're saying, great, that's in my budget. But then, of course, it goes so much further over because somebody's probably got an advocate who's educated their client on what the true value is or maybe they're not wasting time on the property that's quoted within what their real budget is. So I think it's seek professional advice and don't feel bad about it. Real estate agents are selling homes, some of them are selling 150 properties in a year. How many properties does the average person in their lifetime really buy? You're not doing this every day. So I would really, really recommend that you do seek some professional advice, particularly from an advocate. It doesn't have to be me, it can be any advocate. We're all there to work in your best interests. But often it's about guiding you and realigning your expectations to what the true value of a property is. Or maybe, for example, I had some first home buyers recently who kept missing out on villa units and they just kept missing out. We even went to one and we missed out by $5,000. It was very painful for them.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
We ended up buying 3 weeks later, but we pushed out 2 suburbs. And we actually found a property. It wasn't a villa unit. It was a standalone cottage. Land had been subdivided, so it was 350 square meters of land with a standalone cottage on there. And even though they were spending the same amount of money, and yes, they were out a few suburbs from where they wanted to be, in the long term, land is king. That property is probably going to grow more than what the villa units, and it's their first home. It's their stepping stone. So you've got to balance out the, yes, I want to live in this area, but look, maybe I need to sacrifice that area for what's the average time you're holding a property? 7, 8 years? But it's probably going to grow more. But it's not my decision I will just give all the information to my clients and let them come to that decision. But if they're looking at properties that are just completely unrealistic, then I will educate them with actual sales data.
Yep, and I think it's definitely, I guess even a buyer without the education or the guidance of an advocate, you wouldn't think to consider other suburbs really, particularly for those that have been looking for 10 months. Most likely they're still looking in the same suburb.
And particularly if they just keep missing out by that $5,000 each time and then they increase their budget, but then the prices have gone up as well. It can get pretty tricky and you get emotionally attached to and if you just miss out on something, you feel like you just miss out because if you've done the extra 5,000 on top of them, or they might have gone 5,000 above, so you just never know. But you can get emotionally attached and emotionally exhausted So I say those clients that came to me after 10 months, they weren't active for the whole 10 months. There's probably a month in the middle there where they've got stuff.
Yeah, I don't blame them.
Yeah, neither do I.
Absolutely don't blame them. But they did the right thing. They realised that they needed some assistance. There was nothing wrong with that. And they contacted you.
And
how many days did it took them to get into a property from there?
They were a little bit longer. We were about 42 days.
In comparison to 10 months, though.
Yeah, in comparison to 10 months, yes. But they're really happy with the outcome. They're over the moon. They've got their weekends, but I think they've gone on holiday now. They got it within their budget, and I really can't wait 5 years' time when I go and do a sales appraisal for them of what the valuation is. I can't wait to see how much better it's done from the properties that they had been looking at.
And how much money that they spent out for a buyer's advocate versus the money back in their pocket as well in that return.
Exactly.
Well, anyway, I've learned so much, even myself. You provided some really good guidance around how I can even help my clients and giving them sort of general advice on how to navigate the property market and how you can help them too and how other buyers advocates can help them too. But I just want to thank you for coming on the show.
No, thank you.
Really appreciate your time, and definitely it was Ben from Your Key Advocacy.
That's right.
And you can contact Ben or other buyers advocates, and you can also contact Jim's Conveyancing on 131-546 to really build up that cocoon, as Ben said, and start the process, getting the advice from professionals and experts in your areas, and eventually getting into your key home, really.
Yep. Having a team is key.
That's right.
Thanks for having me.